Let's start with questions from the audience, and we have the first hand that went up. I saw it first, this gentleman in the light blue shirt here. And we'll try and track next.
My name is Carl Polzer, and I work on a project having to do with low-income workers, but I also work with...
I don't think your mic is on, actually. I can hear you, but...
I have a throat issue going on. I work with large employers that 75% of their workers are making $11 an hour, and in assisted living, nursing homes. So I had this idea that, two things, and I'm going to have a question, but it reinforces the volatility issue that what if the employers helped or made available tax preparation services to the employees, because it's a wage subsidy that actually helps the employer in some regard. And I started talking to them, and they say, I was talking to some providers, and they say there's this EITC flu that happens every year where the workers quit or they take leave. And they have to hire other people. So it affects the employer to manage that volatility. My question has to do with the long-term savings erosion that might be. I like the EITC, but there's one issue is Social Security. In that, it's my understanding, and I'm really hoping I'm wrong, that there are no payments made to Social Security for this income. And if it's to become a much larger part of income, that's the way that people save. So maybe the government needs to start kicking out $10 billion a year, or the Fed needs to give some whatever, you lower, you raise the cap on social. So I don't know how to raise the money, but we need to make sure that they get credit for it, and that the trust funds fund it. They do?
Yeah.
So all wages below the Social Security cap are subject to payroll taxes, and workers are paying those. They're the employee share and the employer share. They are getting credits for how much work is done, and they're all accumulating those credits, hoping to get to the magical 40 credits and full benefits.
Credit for the earnings that they have for the EITC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so two separate programs. Now the EITC is in excess of what they're paying in payroll taxes in many cases, and I think that's where the confusion comes in. But on the government ledgers, Social Security says you have paid these taxes, and IRS says I am refunding an income tax. I'm not refunding the money that you've been credited to Social Security.
But are they getting credit for that amount of earnings towards their Social Security?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, they are.
Okay,
Yes, they are. So second was this gentleman right here in the front, and then I'll go to the lady over there on row 3.
Herb Rose. I'm not sure whether you addressed it earlier and I just missed it. Over the last 10 years, we've had the Great Recession, and we've had what didn't exist, I think, to any great extent before that, the gig economy. So has data been collected in determining over that period of 10 years and perhaps comparing it with prior years, the effects of the Great Recession and gig economy on the volatility that exists?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer. Does anyone know the answer to that?
I don't think we have seen any studies on what it has done to income volatility, but if you look at the gig economy, it's actually surprising that from the data that we have from the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that between 1995 and 2005, there really wasn't much of a change in any type of contractual work or alternative work arrangements. The big increase has happened between 2005 and 2015 over the course of the Great Recession. So I suspect, from the surveys that have been done, people think of the gig economy as really supplementing family incomes. I know it's not the ideal job, it's not giving you benefits, and it's not giving you the full-time paycheck that you might want. But at the very least, people who didn't have jobs during the Great Recession, who lost their jobs, having access to gig economy platforms, I think went a long way in sort of supplementing and stabilizing incomes, probably better than if they didn't have access to these jobs. So I understand the argument that these are not ideal jobs, but at the same time, what's the counterfactual? If you didn't have these jobs, where would people have gone, given that full-time jobs in the economy were gone? So I suspect that it didn't. It probably made incomes volatile because you don't have the full-time job, but at the same time, it supplemented family incomes.
I'll say quickly, the patterns we see in volatility, although no one's studying month-to-month volatility, as best we can tell, volatility started ticking up in the 1970s.
Yeah.
It is absolutely not a factor of the Great Recession. It's a much longer-term thing. And that's from data over year-to-year volatility, but also looking at how firms are, how firm outcomes are affecting total worker pay during the year. And in the 1970s, there became a much closer correlation to the volatility of firms to the volatility of how much they were paying out to workers. And so workers are bearing more of the risk of firms than they had prior to that. And then JP Morgan Chase Institute has done some work on gig economy that's worth looking at if you're interested in that impact.
Just to build on that for a moment, I mean, the trend, I think one of the tensions that we're wrestling with in this country today is this notion of what are the responsibilities of the employer, and what do we do in a world where the employer is slowly transferring those responsibilities to the employee or the independent contractor, depending on where you are. And so that trend of putting retirement responsibility on the employee has been going on for decades, and now we see it with healthcare for a variety of reasons and so on. And that atomization, which says to the worker, you are now accountable for your healthcare, for your retirement savings, and ultimately for your job, I think is not a new phenomenon. There may be components of the gig economy that are driving more atomization. The statistics, I think, show, though, that most gig workers, at least now, do not do that as their primary job. It is a secondary job, it's a supplemental job, which was, I think, reinforced by your notion about women entering the workforce to bolster declining or stagnating wages. So I think the next question goes right here. There's a microphone coming this way. I didn't forget. Who's next? Did we not get to you? Oh, I'm sorry. No. I kept pointing at her, and then I missed. Please go ahead, and then we'll get to you. My apologies.
That's okay. I'm Gina Adams with the Urban Institute, and first of all, great panel. It's really fascinating. I just wanted to answer one of your questions and pose a question. Why we should care? We've been doing a lot of work here on the implications of instability for children and their development, their healthy well-being. And it's an enormous issue in terms of both affecting their parents and their stress and their ability to parent, but also their access to basic resources like food, housing, good schools, et cetera. So I think the implications, both short and long term, for children and our future are enormous. We have some great work, if I say so myself, on our website. But the other thing I want to flag that I think is particularly interesting is that income instability is just part of a web. So it can cause instability in other places, or it can be caused by instability in other places. And what I appreciate is the number of, it's related to employment, it's related to food stamps. And I'm wondering any insights you all have about what buffers, because one of the things we've posited is that this kind of a stabilizing web, and each sector needs to stop instability and prevent it, but also needs to not be causing it. And I'm wondering whether you have insights as to some of the major factors that are triggering this, or some of the major outcomes that this triggers that haven't already been discussed.
So I'll just say quickly, one of my interests is how much what we've learned in development economics about the lives of poor households internationally is now applying to households in the United States. And one of the things that we think about internationally a lot is the failure of households to invest in their own human capital or to make productive investments. And one of the things that we've learned is so much of that is due to risk and uncertainty, that these households face so much risk that they are unwilling to take on any more risk to make an investment. And that creates this long-term trap. And that is one of my big concerns about the nature of what's happening in the United States, is where you see people unwilling to invest in their future because they experience so much volatility that it's much, much harder to figure out whether those investments are worth making. And we see things like parents telling their children not to take out student loans because they've had so much problem with debt, and telling them you're better off not going to college than taking on debt. Or households taking on debt to go get community college degrees that are not at all going to pay off. And what lesson is that going to teach their children about the value of investment? And I think that's a real big concern.
So I think another part of that web that we explored was, the family. If the family unit is unstable, then the income is unstable. So when adults move in and out of the household, so if you could stabilize the group of people that are sharing resources, then you could probably stabilize the resources that are in that group to be shared.
And the other sort of angle on this that we've been looking at more closely recently has to do with the interplay between this and also physical health, right? So that dealing with this kind of financial insecurity, I mean, we can talk about the mental scarcity and the mental bandwidth, right, issue, but it also creates toxic stress for the body that we know leads to hypertension, that we know leads to heart disease, we know that leads to other long-term chronic issues. And turns out a chronic disease diagnosis leads to financial issues for the family, right? And so it is a circle that I think is one that is ripe for disruption.
So, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I respect about the idea of, women coming into the workforce, but I also wonder if in recent times the income volatility has been increased by changes in industrial patterns. So in Alaska, you might have been an oil worker, but now you're a fishing guide. And therefore, you have income 3 months of the year instead of 12 months. If you're in West Virginia, you used to work in a mine, and now you're also working tourist, or you're working Lowe's. And so my question is about the people who grew up thinking that they would have a stable income. They are in situations beyond their control where the job sources have shifted significantly to more volatility. They've not been conditioned for it. And their generation of children, odds are, have not been conditioned for it either. So I wonder if you could talk about those kinds. If you think of Florida now, that's a state that had a lot of seasonal work. That's not going to be there in November. So I'd like you to approach that kind of situation, which may be increasing.
So what about those disruptions?
I mean, I think the biggest industrial, the biggest decline that we have seen is in the manufacturing economy, where a lot of people, exactly like you described, who imagine that they would have jobs in their local towns, in the factories that existed where their parents worked, and who now don't have access to those jobs because those jobs have gone. I think that is the biggest disruption that we have seen, over the last few decades. And I think, I think the answer to that is sort of those jobs exist, but they require better skills, or they require more skills. And so there's a way to, still match to those jobs, but the jobs of old, or the jobs that existed before, have gone. So absolutely, I think, it has affected families in those towns, and you do see that across the U.S. You do see that the disappearance of those jobs has really gutted those communities, and the kids who are growing up in those communities. And I think the answer to that is skill upgradation, or moving to places where jobs currently exist. In terms of sort of moving to more volatile jobs, I'm not sure.
Well, I was going to say, just picking up on the health conversation, I keep one ear in the workforce development world, and there's so much conversation about career pathing and getting people into jobs that have these pathways, and a lot of people point to the healthcare field. And yet what we're seeing is that it is the people in entry-level healthcare jobs who are coming in, who are contract labor, who are paid, on a volatile basis based on their schedules. And so it's anecdotal, but I wonder about when we're having these conversations about getting people into these kind of new types of employment opportunities, if we've thought about how those jobs are setting people up financially.
I mean, certainly there's a big change in the structure of the American economy, but I think we radically over-romanticize manufacturing jobs. Those were low-skill, horrible jobs until the labor movement. And so when we talk about that these healthcare jobs are low-skill contract jobs, that's exactly what manufacturing jobs were until the labor movement changed them into good long-term. And the labor unions took on the volatility for their members. You had the job banks and if you were laid off, it was the labor union who cushioned you. And we haven't yet had that in these new sectors of the economy. At the same time that even the more skilled jobs, I mean, the number of people in IT, again, supposedly one of these good jobs that are contractors now, look around at who's doing the IT work in the companies that you work for. A lot of them are contractors, and they're subject to volatility too. So I think at core here, it's not really about changing industries. It's about pushing risk from large institutions like the government or like corporations who have the ability to spread that risk and manage that risk onto individuals who don't have the ability to do that.
So there are a lot of hands. We're going to go here, then there, then that face back there.
I want to first thank you again for the panel. Julie Kirksick from Community Advocates Public Policy Institute in Milwaukee. And I have a comment and then a question. The comment is really trying to also answer this issue about what happened to the advanced DITC. I'm so old that I go back to work that we did in the 1990s in Milwaukee at the New Hope Project, where we helped low-income workers get access to the advanced DITC. One of the things that we saw, in addition to what you said, Elaine, about the fear of the uncertainty that you would owe money, that was huge. Second thing was, what was the word on the street? The word on the street was, my cousin did have to pay money. Maybe wasn't true because they're confusing tax policy with the specifics of the EITC. But the most important one that we saw was actually that a lot of employers didn't want to cooperate.
Yes.
And because you had to get the employer to do something to change your W-4 or 2 or whatever it is, I don't remember anymore, you couldn't, people didn't want to be stigmatized. So I say that to go fast forward to, I strongly believe the periodic payment of the EITC absolutely has to be on the table as part of expanding the EITC. I know all the limitations about what IRS can or can't do. But I could go on and on and on about that. I won't, except that I think there are opportunities as we look to expand for childless adults, which gets to a lot of other issues, to look at periodic. And there are great experiments going on that are showing positive results. The question, going to this point about risk, I really appreciate Financial Diaries starkly pointing out how much this is about shifting risk to individuals from employers. What are your ideas for what government can do in addition to the things that government public policy will do directly? But what are your ideas for where government can play a role, or anybody play a role, in changing the expectations of private sector employers?
So this is a little afield from this panel, but we know that there have been a lot of conditions that have made it harder for workers to unionize, and all these right-to-work laws in states. We could take positions at the federal level that make those more difficult and pave the way for workers to actually form unions, get power. And we know when we have strong unions that those employees tend to do better because partly there's another organization taking risk for them, but also even the non-union employees do better because the wages get pushed up for everyone. So we could address this sort of at a regulatory level and not allow this shift of, making it more and more difficult for workers to form groups that can be powerful.
I think there's also work to be done in understanding the business case here. This doesn't get necessarily to your policy question, but do firms actually benefit when there is so much volatility for their workers? I think that's a fundamental, research question that we need to spend more time exploring. We've seen when we start to have, broader questions and conversations about financial security with employers directly, that they're starting to understand the issues that financial insecurity are playing around productivity, around morale, around retention of their workforce. And so as you see a tightening labor market, I think we're also seeing an increased interest from employers in thinking about what is their role in increasing financial wellness among their employees.
So I agree completely on expanding the EITC. I think having a higher EITC and expanding it to childless adults is key. I also think something that is worth exploring with at the local level is paid apprenticeship, like tax credits for paid apprenticeship programs, so that more people are matched to the jobs and trained and provided more training, which I understand that employers are not doing as much of. But I think if we had this push from the federal government that incentivized those kind of training opportunities, I think that would be worth expanding across the country and addressing the unemployment problem at the same time.
And I just quickly point to you, Aspen Epic has put together a report on what are policy options, and rather than going on and list them, aspenepic.org, is that right? Here's a bunch of ideas on things that are worth trying.
Great, so we're going to go here.
Thanks a lot. Justin King from New America. Thank you, everybody. This is a great panel, and I love the way we've tied together a lot of issues. Tim, you called for a top-down review of public assistance as part of this. I couldn't agree more wholeheartedly, and I just wanted to raise for people one example. Churn is a real issue in the financial stability of households. If you're on and off of SNAP, this matters for you, right? This summer it came to my attention, and I think we talked about it. If you qualify for Medicaid in Texas, 5 months after you qualify, they check your eligibility again. Then they check your eligibility again at 6 months, 7 months, and 8 months. If you map that onto Janice Evans's income here, what it appears to be is a trap intentionally designed to kick people off of the program and damage their financial security as quickly as possible in the name of saving the state money or perhaps less kind interpretations. And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge this and all the ways in which public assistance intersects with household economic security. And there are real ways in which we help people ahead, but there are also real ways in which we hold people back. That's going to get worse as volatility increases if we don't address it. And so I would just throw on the table for you all that one of the challenges we face here is not just inertia, but it's also a willful choice to take advantage of this volatility as a way to limit the impact of public assistance programs.
So I'll just insert there my slightly kinder interpretation, while not denying that there are lots of people out there who are doing this for all the worst reasons. But this is a new phenomena for a lot of people. And if you come from a position of, we need to make sure that our resources are devoted to the people who need them most, and you don't really understand what volatility actually looks like because you have an income that's completely stable, then there is a rationale for saying, well, we need to make sure that the wrong people aren't cheating the programs. And so, we learned back in the 80s that those cheaters are most likely actually much higher income. It's not the poorest people. And so we have to change, that idea. But it does have to start with the fact that whether you make enough money this month has nothing to do with whether you're going to make enough money next month. And that does require more and more people really understanding that lots of people have incomes like this and it's not their choice.
Right.
We have about 5 more minutes, and so I'm going to try and cram in. I've got 2 more people ahead of you, and we'll get to you in just a sec.
Hi, Clinky. I hate to follow Justin King's question, always. But I wanted to ask Tim specifically about the people in the study. You document an enormous amount of volatility in their incomes. But what I'm really curious about is how they feel about that volatility. To what extent is it seen as a challenge or a problem versus this is the way my life has been and will be? And a related second question, what do they want public policy to do about it on their behalf?
So I'm slightly embarrassed at the number of questions, but if you, hopefully this encourages you to buy a book afterwards. But I will take the opportunity to appeal. We just don't know enough. Like one of my takeaways from the financial diaries is I want to do more diaries of more people because I have as many questions now. I have more questions now than I did when we started because there's a lot of stuff that I still just don't get. And one of those is people's perception of their volatility does not map at all onto their data of volatility. So often the people who talked about the volatility of their income being a big problem didn't have the highest levels of volatility. And people who had the highest levels of volatility didn't mention volatility as one of their core problems. And I don't really know how to think about that. And that's why I want to do, like, if anybody's a funder out there, you should fund more diaries. But in terms of what the people wanted, it comes back to, I can't remember, we brought it. People were told that if you do these things, then good things are going to happen for you. And what they see is that was not true. Because they did what they were told, and the good things did not happen. And I think from my sense of the conversations I've had, of what they want is they want the promises that were made to them to come true, to be upheld. That if I work hard, if I invest in the future, if I raise my children, if I do these things that you told me would lead to success, I should see success.
There's a great study from Pew that says that that people want financial stability, right, more than even economic mobility. And I often return to that in terms of thinking about this issue around what people want. So the other, I think, data set that we're all eager to mine is that the CFPB dropped yesterday their national data set on financial well-being, right? So they looked at the financial well-being scores that measure people's sense of control and security over their financial lives and mapped that against a whole bunch of other data they had collected about people. None of us have had time to fully dig into it, but what struck me in the executive summary was that people said of the things that correlated with this sense of control and security, this financial well-being, it was the ability to absorb a financial shock. Right? And it gets to this stability question being fundamentally what makes people an ability to feel stable in their financial life is fundamentally what people are yearning for.
Yeah. We have time
That's what
for,
I should have said.
So there was a gentleman right here in the white shirt, and then lady right there in the dark blazer, and those will be our last two.
Thank you. Tom Litke, SB Works. Just building on the romanticizing of the manufacturer, I feel self-employment is highly over-romanticized. Uber has no problem telling you how much you'll make, but they never tell you how much it'll cost your car. And so I guess looking at that, what we haven't really discussed too much is obviously implementation versus policy. I think it's putting a major strain on business support providers. And frankly, a lot of them are following a model, I think, that is more 80s and 90s CDCs and things like that. And I'm just wondering if you had any opinion on, how can we better assist the advisors that are out there. The tax code's not going to get that simple that everybody can figure it out. But everybody still thinks it's the American dream to run your own company, right? So.
My sense is that actually that's not true, is that the vast majority of people don't want and again, back to what we've learned internationally is we created this myth of the entrepreneurial poor, and if you look at microcredit, the vast majority of people don't want it because they don't want to run their own businesses. People want to be employees. They're not frustrated entrepreneurs, they're frustrated employees. And we have systematically in our society removed the opportunity to be employees from larger and larger portions of the population. There's obviously some romanticization of the entrepreneurship, but that most people don't want to own their own company. They want to be an employee, they want security, they want to feel in control, they want some stability that comes along with that. And I think we only really solve that when we take seriously the problem of the hollowing out of the workforce of employees and where that security and stability comes from.
One more question, and I'm just going to bring it to a close because I'm getting the wrap-up sign.
Hi. Thank you. I also have a question for U.S. Financial Diary project. So I'm just wondering how is this project is different from BLS Consumer Expenditure Survey, and they also do have extensive amount of expenditure surveying people, and also do you see any patterns of spending volatility is kind of like similar following the income volatility, or like what's your observation so far?
Kate, since you answered the last question that's so much better than I did.
I'll let you have the last word.
So the diaries are different because we are following up with the same families in person on a very regular basis rather than very short form, how much can you recall? And what we see is that people cannot recall reliably. You have to sort of ask them in the moment if you're going to get closer to the reality of what people are actually doing. Even then, there's all sorts of questions. Why I want to do more diaries is to understand how people answer diaries questions. We do see a lot of a shockingly large amount of expense volatility that shows that people do have ways of managing this. Most of them aren't good ways, but there are ways. And the mismatch is a big, big problem, particularly because the ways that lower income, the more volatility you have, the more likely your ways of managing your mismatch are expensive and unlikely to help you build any sort of upward trajectory.
All right. So lots of interesting conversation about a topic that I think we're going to be hearing more about because I think we could all agree that the stability of past generations is probably gone, and we are continuing to evolve and see our institutions change, our priorities, and the way in which we go about them change. We heard some great ideas and also shown some light on some, I think, pretty big challenges. So more to come on the subject. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and thank the panelists, and particularly Elaine for writing the paper that got us all here today. With that, we'll say goodbye.